Hello, everyone. My name is Kent Broughton, and I am the Community Impact Officer and Equity Analyst for the Center on Community Philanthropy at the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. I want to welcome you all today to our Equity Talk series. The Equity Talk series is a platform for communities and people to have discussion and dialogue about equity. We bring in thought leaders, community leaders, people from within the philanthropic, nonprofit, education, for-profit sectors, to name a few, to talk about equity and what transformational change looks like for them. Today, we have the opportunity to have a conversation with Anastasia Boles, Professor of Law at UA Little Rock Bowen School of Law. Professor Boles brings a passion for empowering communities and people through the tool of law. With her experience in employment law and working with groups and communities about racial equity in different spaces, she brings a wealth of knowledge to this conversation today. Welcome, Professor Boles.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. This is such a great series, and I'm just honored to be a part of it.
Professor Boles, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk with us today. I want to jump right into some questions. The first one that I have is around the distinction between equity and equality. We have had a lot of conversation about what the difference is, but I would love your perspective of giving us the difference between equity and equality through the lens or the context of the legal system. If you could provide that example or what that means, that'd be great.
Yes, I mean, this is a great question, and I think there's a lot of conversation because it's so complex, right? And this is something that, books are written about and careers are made. So I'm just going to give my short explanation, which to me, equality really looks at the input. So you're going to treat everyone the same. In the law, that means you're going to have a kind of standard set of practices. Whereas equity is really going to look at your output, and we may have to change and address the structure to achieve equity in the output. So I'm a former labor and an employment lawyer, and I teach employment discrimination. So we have really cool discussions in class about this. And we talk about Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so the Civil Rights Act is a landmark statutory scheme that entrenches, gave us statutory anti-discrimination law. And Title VII applies to employment. And so as of July 2nd, 1965, it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of race or gender or religion in employment. On July 1st, 1965, it was completely legal. And so we talk about in class how Title VII was this really important, impactful piece of legislation that did not displace any of the racial hierarchy or gender hierarchy that was in employment as of July 1st, 1965. It drew a line in the sand and kind of said, we can't discriminate afterwards. And so you had employers, saying, oh, you need a high school diploma, or you need this IQ test, not requiring that on July 1 of any of their current workforce, but then requiring it on July 2nd because they can no longer discriminate on the basis of race. And so this is such a rich discussion with my students because what could Title VII have done if it were more focused on equity instead of equality? And what things would have been fair, right? Would it have been fair to fire everyone? I don't think anybody thinks that, right? But it's a deeper issue of just make discrimination illegal on this day. And of course, we know we've been trying for 60 years, am I doing my math, to even figure out how to do that piece, right? And so I think that we often like to say, treat everybody the same, but really understanding that the thing that was different on July 2nd, 1965 was the law. It wasn't our minds. It wasn't the structure. And intervening and making, dismantling that racial hierarchy has been a much, much more complex question. So that's the example that really I love that discussion. It gets us into the semester. Many of my students they think racial equity, that's what I want, and then we start to think about how complex that is, how hard that is when you're as a matter of policy. And there are no easy solutions. And so that's why I love being in the law, and I love thinking about it this way.
Yes. Thank you so much for giving us some history or a history lesson.
It wasn't a diatribe.
No, I think that just uplifts the importance of policy and law on this effort around advancing equity. You brought up the Civil Rights Act, and I wanted to see, as we look at present day now, given current events and where we are today, what is the most pressing issue around racial equity and criminal justice that you see within America or even in Arkansas?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. And I think among the host of issues, I try to focus on where I can intervene. And that's really in research, right? And in trying to understand the problem and give that data and that understanding to my community. So throughout the country, but especially here in Arkansas, we don't know enough about the inputs to racial inequity. We know that we're starting to understand more about the outputs. So we know that Black Arkansans are overrepresented in our state prisons. Black Arkansans are 15% of the state population and about 42% of the state prison population. David Boles did a study that found that Black defendants were more likely to be charged with the death penalty, especially in cases involving white victims. And the Racial Disparities Project, which I became a part of when I came to the law school in 2012, released findings in 2015 that furthered Dr. Baldus's work and also found a statistically significant, I'm not the empiricist, right, relationship between race and severity of sentence, and race and the imposition of the death penalty. And the data suggested that for the same crime, that Black defendants are receiving the death penalty more often, more severe punishments when it's not the death penalty, and that there is some different practices in how Black defendants may be charged. And so we just don't understand enough. And so that's really where I feel like my contribution can be, is just how do we figure out these inputs so that we can tweak the structure and achieve equitable outputs.
Yeah, taking a deeper dive in what those inputs are, because we like you said, we kind of know what those outputs are, the disparities in that.
Yeah.
And so you brought up something in that around the how did you get that data, that information? And I think you brought up the Racial Disparities Project. Can you talk more about that? How did it evolve? Where is it now? What's on the new horizon for it?
So the Racial Disparities, and the full name is the Racial Disparities in the Arkansas Criminal Justice System. And so that was started by Professor Emerita Adwa Ayatoro. And when she started it, she was director of what was then the Anderson Center on Race and Ethnicity at UA Little Rock. And she worked with a team of UA Little Rock professors, including David Montague and Tara Dijon, and they convened a 65-person steering committee And I mean, I just think about that now, what a monumental undertaking to involve the community in this project. And that steering committee, we helped design the project and oversaw the project and released findings in 2015. So Professor Ayatoro retired in 2017. I had come to the project as a junior professor, just interested in equity work and plugging in, and she asked me to help lead the project upon her retirement. And so I'm currently one of 4 co-directors for that project. And the Clinton School Center on Community Philanthropy was a huge supporter of ours, and you helped us fund our April 2019 conference. And we brought together 40 organizations, individuals, decision makers. I think we had 80 to 100 people. And it was an important conversation to get ex-offenders in the room with judges, with law enforcement, with other advocacy organizations, and look at what some of these disparities are. So we hope to have more of those types of events and just continue to learn more. So you asked me what was next. So so we were recently approved at the law school to begin a center on criminal justice reform and racial justice, which is extremely exciting to me. I think it'll make a huge impact, has the potential to make a huge impact here in Arkansas. And of course, we're going to focus on all of that research I just talked about. So sentencing disparities and policing and pretrial justice and juvenile justice and charging. But we're also going to get the opportunity to build out the professional development of our students. So think about that scaffolding, because it is this next generation, right? Like, it is about empowering these next leaders. So many students come to law school and they just want to change the world, and we kind of stamp it out of them with all of our rules and statutes. So we really want to use the center to develop and empower that leadership. And of course, which was always our core vision, serves the community. So we'll have a community advisory board. We will be doing CLEs and conferences and speaker series, and we're developing a pipeline program. We're just doing a lot of exciting stuff that I hope will contribute and support the social justice mission around the state.
Thank you so much for sharing that information about the Racial Disparities Project and all the amazing work that you're currently doing and plan to do in the future. It's always nice to know that there are people and organizations along the way that are supporting the efforts around advancing equity. And knowing that you and your organization and the work that you're doing is committed to that is amazing. So thank you for everything that your efforts are putting forth.
Well, and thank you guys for your support and mentoring.
I would like to ask you one last question as we come to the end of our conversation today. What is your equity story? Or perhaps you would like to share some motivation or words of encouragement to people that are doing this body of work of advancing equities in communities, workplaces, and places that they live.
Yeah, that word encouragement, that's just what's been in my heart, because I think that these questions are so complex and contentious that it often feels impossible. And so what I've been thinking a lot about is how to leverage my skill set to make a unique contribution. And I work with organizations on creating inclusive spaces and looking at, anything from whatever policies, procedures that they have, and trying to move that forward towards creating belonging, being more diverse, achieving equity. I noticed that there's a hesitancy to talk about race. In the last year or so, there's a feeling that this is kind of a minefield. And it is a complicated question. It's a hard question, but you don't have to be an expert to do something. And so that's my encouragement. You don't wait to start the work. Use what you have right now, your background, your personality, your skill set. If you are an introvert that reads books, there are things that you can do to bring about racial equity. And that is kind of where the space that I'm working. Like, if we empower one another to keep going, but empower it through our unique backgrounds. And so, doing that, and then also just, we point a lot at what the system does and not at what our hearts are doing and where our own biases may happen. And we are everyday decision makers. And so racial equity, as we fight the very necessary structural fight, also has to be an everyday practice, right? You have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to grow, and that's hard. So that's the encouragement. I hope it was, just a little bit of what I've been going through, which is, how do you make this sustainable? The only way to make it sustainable is to be yourself in this movement, wholeheartedly, and just what can you contribute and then do it. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the ideal that being committed, and offering what you have, whatever that may be. I think that's building up upon what we believe here at the Center on Community Philanthropy, is that everyone has some type of treasure to give, whether it's their time, treasure, or talent, to really make some impact in their communities. And so I definitely agree with that.
We need to listen to all of those people.
Yeah.
And so, and that's where my students teach me so much, that I taught race in the law for the first time, where we just looked at the history of race and law and just the laws around race. And I knew I was going to learn so much going into that semester. And I just learned more than I ever even thought, because the richness of my students' contribution. And we're all, learning this together. So we just have to be committed to walk with one another, stay focused on achieving equity, support one another, but just keep bringing our talents to the work.
Thank you for that charge there at the end. I believe it's meaningful and impactful, and it's necessary for us to be committed in this body of work going forward. Yes. So I want to thank you, Professor Boles, for taking your time out today to speak with us here at Equity Talks. Also, I want to thank everyone that has been tuning in and listening, for we are grateful. And we also would love for you to stay tuned, as we will be forwarding this out immediately after this viewing. So you should be on the lookout for it, where you'll be able to share with your colleagues, with your friends, with your coworkers about this work, and people who are doing this work as we speak. So until next time, I'll talk to you later. Once again,